I'd like to introduce Uncle Albert, who's going to give us an acknowledgement of country.
First of all, on behalf of the Gadigal people, I'd like to welcome everyone here to country, pay our respects to the past and present ancestral owners of this sacred country. And secondly, I'd just like to ask if you'd all like to stand for a minute's silence, just to pay respects for someone that passed away through the week.
I'm Renata and I'm from a group called No Shelter. We're an open feminist collective and we just formed recently in response to the closure of Specialist Homelessness Services and the dismissal of gender violence and women's collective struggles for lives free of violence. So we recognise that what's happened to homelessness services is indicative of what's coming across the welfare and health sectors. We've invited you all here tonight to discuss the going home, staying home reforms that the New South Wales government's introduced. This has introduced competitive tendering into the NGO sector. So previously there were 331 tenders that existed in the homelessness services sector, and these have been reduced to 145. The tendering requires agencies to meet generic service needs, so they need to provide for all clients and all populations from crisis through to long-term housing. So you can imagine that small organisations which are set up to serve specific types of client groups can't compete with that. So in this way, groups came together in what was called consortiums to try and meet those generic needs. But as we said, there were 331 services previously and only 145 tenders, so not everybody got the tenders that they needed. As we know, this means that there can't be any independent women's only or Aboriginal run services, and it's an attack on people who've been historically and systematically marginalised, including women, Aboriginal people, culturally and linguistically diverse people, and people who identify as LGBTIQ. So we're going to have Leslie Lang speaking, and someone from the PSA is going to be giving a speech, and Uncle Albert, they'll be expanding on these issues. So the services, that I'm speaking about, they were created because they meted a need to meet the service needs of people who are systemically discriminated, and they were really hardly fought for, and that's something that Leslie's going to speak a little bit more about. This reorganisation seeks to depoliticise the welfare sector and can be seen as the gutting of what was previously the women's refuge movement, which is now DV New South Wales, and that had existed for decades as a united feminist collective against gendered violence for with over 50 refuges. So I'd like to introduce Leslie. She is a senior lecturer in social work and policy studies at the University of Sydney, where her teaching and research focuses on violence against women and children. Grounded in feminist theories and methodologies, her research is participatory and privileges the voices of those most vitally affected by public policy. The victims, survivors of violence, and the practitioners who work with them. Leslie was the founding director of both the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Clearinghouse and the New South Wales Health Education Centre Against Violence, ECAF.
And thank you to the collective for inviting me here to be part of this really important meeting tonight. I was asked to focus on something about the history of women's specialist refuges, and I actually realised in looking around there's some people better qualified here in the audience who've been through that history to speak about it, so I'll do my best to raise some important issues about that history. I think the most important part of the history is to think about why feminists had to take action and establish refuges for women and children escaping domestic and other forms of male violence against women. Why was that necessary in the 70s? And the reason it was necessary in the 70s is because the existing service sector, mainly large charities, were not able to provide adequate and sensitive assistance. So this change, and I hate calling it a reform, feels to me like back to the future. Women don't need charity, they need justice. And I think that theme is at the heart of what underlies the political ideas behind these changes. Women need safety and empowerment, understanding and the specialist skills that this sector has developed over 40 years. So really we are looking at going backwards. I was saying earlier to somebody that I can't imagine the government restructuring heart treatment services in the state without talking to heart surgeons. And they wouldn't blame the heart surgeons if people still had heart attacks. They wouldn't be expected to do the prevention and do what they do at the crisis end. But somehow women's services are being asked and criticised for not doing what other specialists would not be asked to do. People who've been around the movement will know this is not the first time there's been a struggle to exist and a struggle over funding. After very early successes in getting refuge funding across the country in a short space of time in the early mid-70s, the election of the Fraser government following Whitlam's time led to threats to defund women's domestic violence refuges. And I know that there was a struggle that went on for several years and culminated in the early 80s in demonstrations of women at Parliament House fighting for the right to have refuges funded. The funding was lost federally in the short term, but states that had Labor governments, and New South Wales was one, were able to continue until, because of activism with the incoming federal Labor government, the federal funding was restored. So it gives me some heart to think there's been struggles before and this movement has won. So I think we need not to give up and we need to recognise the strength that's fought through in the past. I want to say some other things about why specialist women's services are so important. They've taught us so much. Safe, women-only spaces generate innovative ideas by women, for women, that I don't think will come from large corporatised organisations. Women's refuges were egalitarian from the start. They realised that violence can happen to any woman. It's not about service providers and clients, it's about all women together, standing together, fighting for justice, as I said before. Long before the public service had equity, equal of opportunity and those sorts of policies, women's refuges made sure that the women working there represented their communities, came from all backgrounds, all walks of life, all sexualities, all cultural backgrounds, way before this was even in other people's policy thinking. As I say, that sort of innovation really can come from women being with women and generating good ideas. The other reason that refuges and other specialist services are so successful is that they actually listen to women and learnt from women, and that's where the practice, knowledge and wisdom of 40 years has come from. From my researcher point of view, I don't think there's anything that I read in a research journal about domestic violence or child sexual assault that women in specialist services don't know and haven't already learnt from women's lived experience. And that's what grounds the service and makes them so important, because they're grounded in women's lived experience, and that gives them a special expertise that isn't elsewhere in the system. Another innovation from this sector was the whole idea that children living with domestic violence are being victimised and being harmed. Often women's services are criticised for being too woman-focused, when in fact, as I say, it was women's refuge workers who said something is not right with kids in this situation, they need to be assisted too. And it took a long time for researchers and the rest of the system to catch up with that idea, but the innovation came from the women's sector. The women's sector also, I think, has led the way because it listens to women in working out how you provide a safe service for women who bear the terrible aftermath of violence and abuse. We know that that can be associated with a lot of problems in living. The aftermath of violence can result in people having problems in their mental health, with substance use, and really unless you see those connections with the underlying violence that's happened in the past and is happening currently to women, you're never going to be able to assist them with those other issues. That really important specialist work has grown and developed and really is under threat by these changes. Putting on my researcher hat, I want to make a few other points from research about what we know about the importance of specialist women's services. Research indicates that nothing keeps every woman safe in domestic violence because perpetrators have an array of tactics that they use in different combinations, in different times, in different contexts. But the two things that consistently have been found and shown to make women safer are going to a refuge, one, or two, going to some sort of specialist domestic violence service. My research involves talking with women about how they go and navigate through the complex array of services we have and when they're trying to deal with violence in their life. And my research backs this up. It's when women meet a specialist service provider who knows the system, who treats her as a partner, walks beside her through the complex system, advocates for her, that things really start to change. We also know from research about women's help seeking in domestic violence that often the government talks about and is very fixated on underreporting of violence. Betsy Stanko from England really put a light bulb on for me when she said, it's all very well to worry about the undisclosed violence, but are we doing any good with the people who are reaching out for help? Let's start at least looking at that. And sadly, the biggest survey on women's help seeking found that most women do tell someone, but a big proportion don't get any help. In that same survey, the only service that was consistently helpful to women and rated by women as helpful was specialist domestic violence services. So we know from practice wisdom, we know from research that these are really important, valuable sources of expertise that are under threat at the moment. I said before that women escaping violence and girls escaping violence and abuse need justice. A big part of these changes threatens to, and is trying to, I think, silence the voice of advocacy that comes from this very strong sector. It's not about, this work was never about working just with individual women and just providing housing. It was about promoting a world with gender equality, and it was about advocating for systems that actually responded to what women need with their children and girls need escaping violence. This is a voice that governments find uncomfortable. Most of them, though, around the world realise that it's essential. This sector is probably the strongest critic of government and its many new plans that are rolled out quite regularly, action plans, strategic plans, whatever, many strategies rolled out, often with very good intent. But really it's the workers in this sector who hear from women when things aren't working, who have to say, I'm really sorry, your well-intentioned policy or practice really needs changing, it's not working. Usually, as I say, most governments have recognised they've got to listen to that voice because it's the voice closest to women and it's a voice that's really going to make sure that services keep improving. My biggest fear about this change that's coming is for individual women and children who will suffer, but also for that loss of the strong advocacy voice that's going to be able to speak out very quickly when whatever government and services are doing is not actually assisting women and children. Okay, thank you.
And only yesterday it was Gabrielle Upton, the Minister for Family and Community Services, came out saying that the reforms were changing because they were evidence-based, unlike current practice. And obviously there's a large body of evidence that many people in this room could support with their practice that's been completely ignored. So next I'd like to invite Uncle Albert to speak. He's of the Wankamara Bob from Burke area. He's an activist who's currently involved with the campaign to stop the continuation of stolen generations that's mobilised by a group of grandmothers in Gunnedah, New South Wales, called Grandmothers Against Removals. And the campaign's putting focus on the pressure on docs and facts.
Yes, I'll need to give an Aboriginal perspective on how these cuts and so on affect our communities as well. I think we've certainly got a handful on our hands when we talk about domestic violence and abuse. It's pretty much embedded into our communities as well. We have a very high incarceration rate because of domestic violence. We have a lot of dysfunctional families because of domestic violence, and also as a result of domestic violence we have a high rate of Aboriginal children now in out-of-home care. I think we've got the numbers up to in New South Wales up to 45,000 Aboriginal children are now in out-of-home care, and this is pretty much a continuation of the stolen generations, which the Grandmothers Against Reconciliation have been campaigning against since February this year. I started to support that mob because I was personally affected by a removal. I had an 18-month-old daughter that was taken from our care in 2012, which was only 2 years ago. She was 18 months then, and she's 3 years now. So they came in without notice and handed us a warrant, search warrant, to say that they were there to remove my child from our care. And so yeah, it was a personal issue that was very hard for me to deal with. So it was I was encouraged to support the grandmothers through that personal effect. And I think now to look at the Royal Commissions over the last few months into the Forgotten Australians, and 1997 to bringing them home report for the stolen generations and the recommendations and issues and concerns that were raised out of those reports. You know, we're dealing with a few generations of abused children. We have a few generations of parents that are raising children through being personally, physically, mentally and sexually abused in government care. And you know, you look at the issues of society that we're dealing with today, not only in our own communities, in Aboriginal society, but society in a context as a whole. We're dealing with a lot of societal problems which amount to homelessness, which amounts to incarceration rates, which amounts to juvenile delinquency. So there's a lot of those societal problems can be attributed to the abuse that have been occurred, that are pushed upon generations of children, which not only were Aboriginal but non-Aboriginal as well, as we're learning now from the Forgotten Australians Royal Commission that's taking place. So, you know, it's pretty much imperative that services like the refuges that cater for the needs of young girls and families that are suffering from violence and particularly domestic violence. My conflict with that is that they don't do enough to assist and try to normalise families and then work with the dysfunctional families as a whole. Because in our communities it's pretty important that each and every part of our family members, our extended family, becomes a part of our cultural learning, our cultural education of our children. And for us to fully have that educational experience with our child, we'll need our families to be fully functional. And unfortunately, with a lot of the societal problems that we suffer in our communities and in general, everyone else with alcohol and drugs, the drug abuse, you know, I think services need to look at at being a little bit more sensitive and compassionate in working with families and making sure that we don't divide the family group as a whole. We try to work with the family groups to try and bring back functionality and so that we can work towards a stable environment, a better environment for the child and the family. And again, you're looking at the cuts that have impacted on Aboriginal people over this budget. We're looking at 580 million that was taken from our services. That is a very, very big impact on the lower socio-economic section of this community when we're looking at disadvantage and how we can better improve the lives and the health status of Aboriginal communities when you're taking a big chunk of those finances away, and then the services that are imperative to making inroads into our communities. We need to make sure that those dollars stay in our communities. Otherwise, our communities don't become stable. They don't become, our families remain dysfunctional, and then therefore allow our children to be more at risk of allowing the departments to keep pouring in systemic abuse on our families and ripping them apart by taking their children from their families where they rightfully belong. You know, we've had instances where we've got the Department of Community Services now going into hospitals and taking families, taking babies after they're just being born and not even having a chance to be breastfed by their mothers and taking them away without the proper legislative requirements to do so. They're doing it with knowing that it's an illegal act for them to do so, but they still go in and they still take those babies without the parents' consent to breastfeed that baby until that baby at least has a connection. And I think looking at all you ladies here, you've got a maternal instinct, and you would understand how devastating, how disheartening that would be for you as a mother to have your baby ripped from your womb, basically, and not having a chance to build that bond and that relationship to your mother, to your child. And we all know if you've got a maternal instinct and a parental instinct inside of us, then we will know that a bond between a parent and a child is one that is very, 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 very important. One that is a learning experience for both parties, both parent, mother, father and child. Not only do we teach that child, but that child teaches us as well. Even though he doesn't know what he's doing, he's teaching us very, very important lessons in life that we need to hold on to. And because of our families are so dysfunctional and been ripped apart by the stolen generations for generations and generations of our communities. I've had my grandmother and my grandfathers taken. I've had my mother taken. I've had my brother taken. I've had my daughter taken. So every generation of my family has been stolen by the department, has been kidnapped by the Department of Community Services, who they thought they had a legislative right to do so. And these things are still happening in Aboriginal communities today without the knowledge of people out there in the communities that are there to assist and help families that have been sexually abused and been torn apart by things that are not really a part of normal life. Because we don't live like the white Australians, they think that they can come in and tell us by ripping our babies apart that we've got to change our attitudes. This is how they try to assimilate us into your lifestyles. And they are forcefully doing that into this day. And we still have to live with that abuse. We still have to live with that torment. And there is no room for us to heal. There is no room for us to take command and control of our lives, because we do not have the compassion. We haven't had that bonding between our families to learn how to love and show that compassionate spirit. We're still fighting that. If they're going to continue to take that from us, all we're going to have left is hatred. And that's why there's a big split between Aboriginal communities and non-Aboriginal communities out there today. That's why there's a fear factor that bridges the gap, that keeps the gap divided between us. And unless we all start to take a holistic approach at doing that, and unless we all start to look at an holistic approach at combining our services, because that's what we're doing with the Grandmothers Against Reconciliation and the Stolen Generation movement, is to try to build a national movement that'll really pull our communities together. That'll try to provide a little bit more stability and provide a national framework for not only our communities, but service providers. Service providers and communities working together to build a platform, to build a framework that allows us to stand up to governments, that allows us to stand up to the domestic powers that keep us suppressed, the domestic powers that keep us at a disadvantage. And unfortunately for the wider communities, you don't feel that until you start to feel the funding cuts. And when you feel the funding cuts and you see that the funding cuts are impacting on your services and the way that you provide your services, you begin to jump up and down. But this is a daily life for Aboriginal people. This is a daily struggle for Aboriginal communities. There's a perception out there that we're getting free cars and we're getting all this money from mining royalties and so on. But it's not the fact. The fact is that Aboriginal people struggle just as much as the socio-economic disadvantages in the non-Indigenous communities. We struggle just as much, and if not, even worse, because there's a misconception. But it's up to our communities to band together to fight that fight. And we need the support of our communities. We need to band together because we have a very select few that have been chosen by governments to speak on our behalf. And they are making very, very important decisions with the government on signing away our sovereignty over our country. They are signing away and they're asking us to become recognised in your constitution. If we get recognised in your constitution, then that means that we have to surrender our sovereign rights over our country. And we don't wish to do that yet. We don't wish to do that because we have a cultural obligation as custodians of this country to remain custodians of this country. And we can only do that as sovereign owners of this country. And there are tribes, there are nations out there galore, Aboriginal nations that are fighting against the recognition movement and the constitutional reform movement, because we don't want that to take away our initial rights of ownership of this country. And we are banding together, we need to band together so that Aboriginal people can take control of our own destinies, and we can start to become a thorn, I guess, in the side of the government when it comes to our disadvantage. Not only fighting against the stolen generations and fighting against the funding cuts that are really hurting us severely, but also hopefully to entice and encourage service providers and non-Indigenous Australians out there to support the movement as well, and to become a part of what will need to be a mandate against the government in doing things like this. At the moment we can sit and we can talk, and all the budget protests that have been happening since the announcement of the budget, they aren't going to get us nowhere. All you see on TV is that a whole group of people are sitting around and arguing about whether these cuts are going to hurt us, when in reality they're not going to do nothing about it at all. So unless we band together, unless we start to form a national movement against those cuts, then you're going to start to have more of an impact on the changes starting to have an effect on your immediate services. You know, and unless a national movement starts to make demands on those cuts to be reinstated so the services can better provide services to the communities, then that's the way forward. And that's the way forward that we see Aboriginal communities doing as a national movement, as a national collective to address our disadvantage and our fights in an arena that's been a very volatile one, and it's been a very, very long war between black and white Australia and this country. And it really hasn't come to a standstill, it really hasn't come to an end. And the environment over the last 10 years sort of pushes us now to look at ways that we can make these changes, to really make changes so that Aboriginal people can start to take control of their own destinies and make decisions in regards to how our children are better serviced and provided for if in any need or any risk of harm, and work with services like the refuges to make sure that any risk of harm amongst communities, and the community starts to control how that child then slots back into family and community life, and make sure that they keep hold of that, the cultural teachings that they need to hold on to as part of their Aboriginal identity. And thanks a lot for listening.
So my apologies, it's quite a long report, and I've only seen it just a few minutes ago, so I'll do my best. So these are responses from PSA members and community services, formerly DOCS, including the Domestic Violence Line, Child Protection Helpline and activist perspectives. Our members are appalled at the closures, and they contextualise the closures in the relentless process of outsourcing and philanthropic forms of privatisation being implemented by the state government as funding continues to be shifted relentlessly from the public sector to the most powerful NGOs. The PSA members who were interviewed say that maintaining a high level of domestic violence services is integral to maintaining women's refuges. In our experience, these specialised services are invaluable. They include providing domestic violence crisis housing for women who are escaping from violent relationships with their children, trauma counselling, transitional casework, one-to-one case management, court support and support when police are present, intensive assistance in finding community housing, support and guidance in developing a safety plan, placing a high priority on the safety of children and monitoring of child protection and parenting issues, liaising with community services and other child protection agencies in relation to child protection concerns, providing reports to the Child Protection Helpline in compliance with mandatory reporting responsibilities. We know that the greatest risk occurs when a woman is leaving an abusive relationship. Community service workers are concerned that the closure of women's refuges will result in women staying home longer than they want to. The data shows that in New South Wales in the 12 months to September 2012, 27 out of 35 female homicides occurred in the domestic context. There is no doubt that historically women who stay with a violent partner are at higher risk. They're concerned about women leaving their children behind with the abuser. One example, a woman leaves an abusive relationship. Fearful of being homeless, she leaves the baby behind with the maternal grandmother, who's been living in the same house. After the mother leaves, the perpetrator starts to attack the grandmother. Then the baby is exposed to more cumulative trauma. Another example is offenders who threaten violence to women from the jails prior to release. Without a good deal of fine coordination between probation and parole, police and women's refuges, it will be much more difficult to protect women from stalking and assault from these perpetrators. To protect women and children, the offender's parole is usually revoked prior to release, but ultimately the perpetrator will be released into the community without any monitoring or reporting requirements. The only means of protection remaining would be an AVO, and AVOs are least effective when dealing with men in this group. Close interagency collaboration designed to maximise the safety of mothers and children would not be achievable in a typical low-security mainstream setting, the kind of setting that they're proposing. What the Community Services Child Death Report in 2012 tells us about child protection and domestic violence. In January 2010, following a recommendation of the Wood Special Commission of Inquiry into Child Protection Services in New South Wales, the threshold for mandatory reporting was raised from risk of harm to risk of significant harm. Domestic violence continued to be the primary reported risk for the families and children who died between 2010 and 2012. In 2010, domestic violence was reported in 64% of cases. In 2011, 58% of cases. and in 2012, 64% of cases. So it's on the rise. Thus, raising the risk level did not impact on reports of domestic violence. 466 children died between 2007 and 2012 where domestic violence had been reported risk. Over the same period, there were 302 child deaths by causes unrelated to domestic violence and where there had been no reported risk of domestic violence. I'm going to skip forward. When children are removed by community services due to exposure to domestic violence, they may eventually be placed in long-term foster care. In most cases, this is irreversible and a devastating loss to many parents who will never recover from the trauma. Aboriginal parents face the shocking reality of the continuing stolen generation and ongoing cumulative intergenerational trauma. There are 10 times more Aboriginal children in the foster care system. We've heard that there's been a $515 million increase in funding to NGOs. This has to be seen in context as an incentivising measure to lure and appease the big four Christian charities. The relentless shift of funding from the public sector to the non-government sector leads to mindless and expensive mainstreaming. In fact, we've seen a similar pattern as a consequence of the privatisation of out-of-home care. The trend towards increasing funding to the non-government sector away from the public sector has resulted in a 150% increase of funding for FACS. The big semi-marketised charity are the main recipients of this generosity. I'm going to move on to the view of PSA members from the domestic violence line. So these are frontline workers. The community service website states that the domestic violence line makes referrals to women's refuges and explains what they are and what they do. However, staff are saying there are simply not enough places for women and children. It is almost unbearable for staff to be regularly telling desperate callers that they are unable to assist with a refuge or other housing placements. The message is you can't mix homelessness and domestic violence. Staff are aware that Housing New South Wales started to mix them up about 2 years ago and have been seeing the terrible consequences ever since. The Housing New South Wales bureaucracy has maintained that DV and homelessness are interchangeable because homeless people have experienced domestic violence. The question is, how do you prevent domestic violence with this approach? It's not possible because the two groups are incompatible when it comes to practical interventions and supports that work. Genuinely homeless people can't be placed in refuges because they invite male friends and relatives in, they give out the address, and they don't need police support. DV victims won't put up with people coming off ice or other illicit drugs and would also have difficulty being housed with people who have significant day-to-day functioning issues due to mental health difficulties. Service integration in the generalist model can traumatise homeless people by putting them in with people going through a domestic violence crisis and vice versa. At a recent Housing New South Wales conference, a Canadian guest speaker warned the audience not to make the same mistake that's been made in Canada. Her warnings were ignored. One homelessness agency converted the service back to domestic violence. Hotel accommodation is now heavily relied on for crisis domestic violence accommodation, if you can believe that. This is a last resort, as there's always a possibility that a woman's partner can come around to unprotected premises. Caseworkers know that the pool of possible hotels and motels that will house domestic violence clients is running out because hotel proprietors have sometimes had trouble in the past with DV clients and don't want to take any more risks. Housing New South Wales hotels are rough, They have sometimes put domestic violence perpetrators and victims in the same complex. The male partner will ring up the housing crisis line, say he's looking for housing, and end up in the same place. The DV line knows of women who have been placed in rooms above pubs. The Housing New South Wales Housing Reform Team was formed in November 2012 and has not had a positive impact on the crisis. The Staying Home Leaving Violence program is a program that has a little more funding. They provide duress alarm systems. This is aimed at providing intensive support for those who want to remain in their own homes. Since refuges began to close, there have been more calls to the DV helpline and more desperate calls from charities. For example, a pastor calling about a parishioner. The expectation is that they'll be placed in a safe place. 2.5 positions at the DV line were recently terminated to make way for more management positions. Caseworkers are struggling with so much adversity on the job, yet personal supervision has been discontinued. DV caseworkers are deeply concerned about their service winding up. It's possible, as rumoured, that they'll be taken over by a national domestic violence line. A preliminary analysis of housing funding under Staying Home, Going Home summary reveals the expectation on services to work with perpetrators and victims. There's an expectation on domestic violence victims to get support from their local area. And this is not recognising that this is actually the most unsafe area. These issues pose the question that a conflict of interest rule could be applied. The summary highlights that the focus is on funding to services that indicate they do everything, such as rapid rehousing. And this is without evidence. The main report indicates that nearly all services have a high focus on Indigenous people and families. How can it be assured that this will be followed through? Past experiences belies that this can be achieved. Is this just high-sounding rhetoric? So she's mentioned there's confirmed closures to Kalara Women and Children's Refuge, Jean's Place Women and Children's Refuge in Randwick, and Erin's Place in Ryde. And there's possible but not confirmed closure to St Anthony's Single Women's in Goulburn, the Marion Centre, Immigrant Women's Speak Out, Alandra Refuge Single Women and Children in Toukley, and Maruya Single Women and Children's Refuge near Nowra. There are significant issues around people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds as well. The women who are not refugees, women are not refugees. So there's a large number of women who are on temporary visas, and immigration is clamped down. When women from this group have called for help and received no assistance, they won't ring again. Some refuges have been funding places for these women, and they can stay 2 years or so, and this becomes a huge demand on the resources of the domestic violence refuge. They're not entitled to housing or Centrelink. Consequently, they're often compelled to stay with an abusive partner. They're often not allowed to leave the house. It is known that women have become servants to gay men and their partners. Some of the women are compelled to leave to have children to please their families back home. There's a risk of reprisals for women who go back home to Pakistan. New Zealanders are not entitled to public housing, so refugees pick up the bill. They'll have nowhere to go and are forced to stay with violent men. The loss of the Immigration Women's Speak Out is a small service, but it does invaluable work with women leaving domestic violence without permanent residency, and it's a terrible setback. There's also signs of outsourcing from the Child Protection Helpline as well. Integration of the Homeless Persons Information Centre with the Housing Contact Centre. There's been a lot of confusion around that. So the state Safe Home for Life reforms are ostensibly implemented to take pressure off the helpline services regarding non-risk of significant harm. And a new intake and referral model will start up in Campbelltown and trialled for 12 months. It's intended to allow an early response to the needs of vulnerable CYP. Young people? Sorry. Children and young people. Okay. Okay, I'll just stand there.
Thank you so much, Adri, for stepping in at the last minute. And thank you to our other speakers. It's been really great to hear from you. So we're about to have a quick break, just a 15-minute break to have a snack and a cup of tea, go to the loo if you need to. And then if you could come back, we're going to have one more speaker from the No Shelter Collective, and then we want to have a chance to hear from all of you. I know there's lots of people with valuable experience here that I'd really like to hear from. So I wanted to thank Alfalfa House, who've donated a bunch of food to us for that said, there were a couple of costs in running the forum, and there'll be a couple of spaces you can put in some donations, and if there's any extra money, we're going to be giving that to the block, to the tent embassy, which is down there. And one last thing, in the space just to the right out that door, there's a bunch of post-it notes on the ground. We were hoping that during the break some discussions and some thoughts about what type of movement they'd like to see, what sort of changes, what sort of action they'd like to be involved in. So be it, I would like, to write a letter to my MP, or I'd like to occupy one of the refuges that is closing. We'd love to hear all of your opinions. Put them up there. Okay, see you in 15 minutes. So we've just got one more speaker, and then we're going to have a discussion. And I'd like to introduce Shelley, who's another member of the No Shelter Collective, and she's going to deliver a speech that we worked on collaboratively as part of the No Shelter Collective.
Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we meet here upon Aboriginal land, the land of the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to the elders and custodians of this land, past and present. The sovereignty of this land has never been ceded. My name is Shelley, and I'm speaking as a member of the No Shelter Collective. I've also been a worker in the women's services sector for a few years now, and like you all, I'm horrified to see the latest attacks on the scarce services that are currently available for women, youth and Aboriginal communities. I'd like to thank our speakers for their powerful insights tonight, and for most importantly reminding us that it was grassroots movements that led to the creation of these specialist services. It was the feminist movements that were responsible for setting up the women's refuges that now form part of the networks of services within DV New South Wales. It was the fierce Aboriginal rights movements of the 1970s that led to the essential Aboriginal controlled services like the AMS. As we heard from our PSA worker, there's a lot of cuts right across the welfare sector. The funding of the DV hotline has been reduced, and the Homelessness Persons Information Centre appears to have merged with the Housing Contact Centre. 5 workers only are supposed to operate a 24/7 service.
Shame.
There is further alarm that even this scarce service may well be rolled into the Housing New South Wales Contact Centre, this reorganising a broader attack of the welfare sector. There have been consistent attacks, as we've spoken of, on welfare services over the years, and we need to understand these within the context of an agenda to perpetuate structural and historic sexism, as well as a rewind of the gains of these struggles to facilitate and enact the neoliberal reorganisation of the welfare sector. We can see once again a fresh wave of attacks with the recent announcements, or the recent, it's actually happening now, I guess, with the tenders being announced, the going home, staying home reforms by the New South Wales government, along with Abbott's federal government announcements, which, as we all know, are set to slash hundreds of thousands of dollars from services and the welfare sector nationwide. It is in response to this that No Shelter formed. We are an open, community-based feminist collective interested in building a grassroots response to these cuts. We know that 1 in 2 women daily are turned away from existing crisis accommodation services, and that there is 1 death every week due to domestic violence. We know that the private housing market is totally inaccessible for people on welfare, yet public housing is being sold off at unprecedented highs. We know the attacks on Aboriginal controlled services will devastate communities who are already fighting against the highest rates of forced child removals ever seen in Australian history, as well as apartheid incarceration rates, unacceptable poverty and cycles of disadvantage. The closure of any of these services is not only unacceptable, but represents a pointed and conscious form of systemic violence against marginalised people in our society. Workers, service users and the broader community recognise this, and yet it can be seen that the competitive tendering enforced by Going Home, Staying Home has pitted services against one another, forced refuges to split up into consortiums to meet geographical tender packages, and has sought to undermine our collective power. The widespread resistance to the reforms has been largely silenced as services fear their funding cuts or jeopardising consortium relationships by speaking out. Workers' voices have been similarly silenced, as employment conditions have been and continue to be precarious. No Shelter has heard that in some cases, across government-funded sectors, there have been official directives from management bodies that workers keep quiet or risk losing their job. Peak bodies that workers expected to fight against the reforms have been silent, and even worse, have actually worked against those trying to organise resistance. Many work conditions are set to worsen. There are ongoing redundancies, short-term contracts rather than permanent roles, and loss of additional leave, many workers simply not knowing on a daily basis if or when their service may close or be taken over by a lead organisation. The ongoing confusion regarding the impacts of these changes, even now with the majority of the tender results announced, has seen vital services operating below capacity as they hesitate to take on new clients or replace staff when the future of their services is unsure. Service users have already been turned away from crisis accommodation at higher rates. Many who are in temporary housing experiencing great distress and fear due to uncertainty regarding any long-term housing options. Understanding this oppression and the need to connect with resistance, No Shelter sought to contact as many of the 82 services that were unsuccessful in their tenders as possible. We spoke to workers from over 40 of these services. From these conversations, the new landscape of the homelessness service has emerged as one in which funding is being channelled, as we've heard, towards major NGOs, and critically among these to just a few large Christian organisations. In privileging Christian organisations, this inherently privileges values that include heteronormative nuclear families that historically and generally depend on women performing unwaged care work. The government is invested in the shift to NGOs to reduce overheads. It's a way to cut the public sector while still controlling the services provided by contractors, and also shifting or redistributing risk onto non-state actors. On top of this, Christian NGOs can draw on a pool of volunteer labour, thereby making their operations even cheaper. Workers that we have spoken to also raised grave concerns about the takeover of their services by Christian organisations, because as we heard from Uncle Albert earlier tonight, it is well known and has been well documented and is now subject to a royal commission that there have been horrific systemic abuses of children and service users within faith-based organisations delivering welfare. There has not been the same level of accountability or transparency demanded of religious organisations as there is of state-run services. We all know there are many groups of people that simply cannot feel safe or comfortable accessing support from church-based organisations, with several churches openly homophobic and opposed to abortion. Several workers spoke to No Shelter about their concerns that women needing to have an abortion would experience judgment or discrimination from religious organisations providing support. Churches have played a violent role in the colonising of Australia and assimilation of Aboriginal people. And this has been raised within the community and by workers. No Shelter spoke to Kevin, who works at an Aboriginal crisis accommodation service, and he describes seeing clients returning to unsafe and violent situations, as there are very few referral pathways now available. The generalisation and homogenisation of services into large streamlined bodies and the watering down of critical approaches is of concern across the sector. Many workers from women's refuges have expressed worry and concern about the acute focus on homelessness instead of domestic violence, suggesting societal problems that are actually the root cause of this homelessness will be overlooked. So, in the face of all of this, what can we do? We organised this forum because we think that we need to build a strong, fierce analysis of what is happening to us, strengthen the solidarity that this process has attempted to dismantle, and turn our collective abilities towards the action that we want to take. We have heard from workers, and some have expressed their desire to see rallies, sit-ins, mass movement. The struggles of people on around various forms of welfare have been historically key to any powerful resistance that leads to significant social change. And we haven't seen the crest of these reforms or changes yet. What is happening within the homelessness service is indicative of what is coming across the welfare and health sectors. We think that we need to be organising actions together and supporting each other to take actions wherever we are. No Shelter just formed. We have some ideas about actions we'd like to take, and we know that the collective will evolve. No Shelter is open to anyone. We hope to add to the efforts that have already been happening, and we will be meeting fortnightly to organise. We know amongst the silencing and uncertainty that it's been difficult for all of us to speak up. As we move to discussion, we urge people to take courage in recognising the solidarity we all have here tonight, and broadly through networks that have sent through their support to us as we organise this meeting. No Shelter acknowledges and commends those who have spoken and those who will speak tonight. The momentum is building and we're not going to be silenced. Yeah.